Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Scope here on British Muslim TV with me, your host, Waqar Rizvi. As with every week, we're being broadcast live throughout wherever British Muslim TV is broadcast live on satellite, as well as through our various social media channels as well. You can see the numbers at the bottom of your screen. Please do send in any questions and or comments you may have, even throughout the show. And if any of them are pertinent, I will put them to our esteemed panelists. Now, today we're going to be discussing the OPEC meeting, which is coming up tomorrow, as well as energy geopolitics coming, of course, ever since the Russia-Ukraine war, as well as other such geopolitical issues as well. Now, energy supplies have always really, if we're honest, been tools within geopolitics and diplomacy. Now, as the OPEC Plus group is set to meet, and the many hypotheses about what the organization may or may not do regarding output are settled, one wonders if the Saudi-Russian cooperation will preserve both sides' interests still. The war in Ukraine has certainly shocked Europe into realizing its wish to end dependency on Russian supplies of energy are not as easily wished away. Now, at the same time, any U.S. release of its possible strategic supplies would also change OPEC Plus's questions as well as their calculations. The JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, is also a huge factor and still hangs on barely. Now, would the U.S. revive the deal just to tap into Iran's vast potential supplies to the market? And would the Iranians even play that game against the Russians in some ways, if I may say so? Let's discuss those issues and others with our esteemed panelist who is joining us live today. We're joined by Dr. Paasha Mahdavi, who is an author. He's also an Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's affiliated with the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management. He's also the director of the Energy Governance and Political Economy Lab, which is part of the 2035 initiative at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Paasha, thank you very much for taking your time out to join us today here in The Scope. Let's start off right at the top, Paasha. The question on everyone's minds, as you know, as we spoke of off air, going into any OPEC meeting is, will there be an output increase or not? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me on. I will say, a quick caveat, predicting OPEC's next moves is a bit like reading fortunes in coffee grounds, as we do in Iran. But what we do know about OPEC is that right now there are very severe constraints on production capacity. Within the past year, for example, OPEC Plus countries have already agreed to restore production levels back to the pre-pandemic levels, but production is still lagging far behind. And of course, obviously, as we'll probably talk about, much of the blame is on Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the sanctioning of its oil. But the reality is that really only two countries within OPEC, OPEC Plus rather, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, have really any spare capacity at the moment. Nearly every other OPEC Plus country is struggling to even hit their existing OPEC quotas. And so that's really the question that is bearing on many of the members in this conversation about whether to increase oil production is, can oil production be increased? And I'll add one more point, which is that even that spare capacity that I mentioned, that's the idea of just having enough ability to produce more. Even that spare capacity in the Saudi Arabian and the Emirati oil sectors has come into question. Some saying that the maximum increase might even be just 1 million barrels per day. And to put that in perspective, the world likely needs double that given rising demand towards the end of 2022 and 2023. So that really is the main issue at play right now, is whether production can even be increased, let alone the decision to try to increase that production.
There was a lot of talk, Paasha, about the Biden trip to Saudi Arabia, right? Even before he went, everyone was saying he's going because he wants to beg for more energy supplies, right? That was the talk even in mainstream US media. Do you think that the Saudis do want to increase production to keep the Americans happy? Because, bringing the Russians in, if I may, to discussion for a moment, the Russians do not have bad relations right now with the Middle Eastern countries, right? Because they didn't stand against Russia, even at the UN Security Council or at the UN period. In fact, even after Russia, invaded Ukraine. So, is that almost a sign that the Saudis as well may not play ball as the Americans may currently want?
Well, one of the other issues at play here that is a pressure that may be too hard to ignore on the Saudi side is kind of managing the OPEC plus alliance. And in particular, there is this question of Russia effectively transferring any of its quota or market share to other countries. It fought considerably hard for that market share to have near parity with Saudi Arabia. That was one of the selling points that the Saudis, gave to include Russia and OPEC plus and kind of keeping them within the cartel. And so that is a pressure that is too hard to ignore for the Saudi side if that is going to interfere with some of those existing agreements. Now, of course, many have noted Russia's continuing to sell its discounted oil to India, to China. It's finding new outlets and ways to live in the context of sanctions, rather than lose that hard-fought market share within kind of the OPEC plus pie. So I think that is going to be a signal that is perhaps louder and more relevant for the Saudis, rather than kind of the calls and lobbying, is probably the right word for it, by Western leaders, both the US, the EU, the UK, to increase production to help bring down energy prices.
There was also talk about the US releasing part of its strategic reserves and pressuring other countries around the world to do so. Now, I don't want to get too technical here and into the various intricacies of oil supplies, but just what does that mean? Because that's obviously also a political decision at some level, right? I mean, that's also a signal, a political signal, beyond just wanting to have more supplies in the market and to bring prices down. It is also a political message to the Russians, I would think, and possibly even the Saudis.
Yes, definitely. I mean, this is part of this bigger kind of oil Cold War that has existed for the past decade and a half with respect to rising U.S. oil production, especially from shale, for example, in the face of OPEC oil production, right? And now OPEC plus, if you include Russia. Those releases from the strategic reserve, right, they kind of come with this idea that there is backing for increased production down the line. And so that is part of this game. That is part of this war, rather, this Cold War, as some call it, between kind of the shale production in the United States side and the more conventional oil production on the Saudi side and the Russian side. So that's where I see that move kind of fitting in. Of course, practically speaking, it's a very short-term solution, right? The reserve itself does not have the amount of oil to really cover any long-term domestic consumption, for example, in the United States, for the kinds of time periods that people are talking about in terms of ramping up oil production, increasing investment right now in oil to increase supply, given the high prices. That takes years. And the Strategic Petroleum Reserve release is really a matter of months, maybe a year, depending on how much they're adding. So it's a signal, it's a move, and it certainly fits into that broader strategy. But the practical impact of it is a bit more limited in the market itself.
And to add to the complication of whether or not political leaders will make the decision or not at OPEC, which others around the world would want, there's also the reality of we're coming out still of the pandemic. We may very well be back in it. We don't know this winter, but that's a huge calculation, is it not? And beyond that, then there's also a global manufacturing downturn, in fact. So I just question then, is there any logic into actually increasing output right now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's the question that's on a lot of people's minds right now, is what is the demand market going to look like? Not just as we come out of the pandemic, but 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, right? The oil market in particular, I mean, before we kind of talk more about gas, but the oil market in particular has a lot of long time horizons, relatively speaking. An investment today in a conventional oil field pays off for the next 5 to 25 years. Right? I mean, probably even beyond, right? So any investment made today in, say, a greenfield site, anywhere where we might know there's a good chance of producing oil, to actually getting to production right after discovery still takes many years. So you have to be able to know, is that demand going to be there 4 or 5 years down the line? What is the global consumption going to look like? And so a lot of oil producers and companies themselves have been fairly skittish in that. That's why there is this existing undersupply. When the pandemic started, it was the same conversation in the middle of the pandemic. Even now, there are still a lot of companies hesitant to invest in oil, invest in future oil exploration, and they're currently holding and trying to wait and see what will happen. And so you're exactly right on this point of, is there really such increased demand? Why would we all of a sudden think of it as this need to open this reserve? And again, I point back to more of the signaling effect rather than the practical effect that might have. The other side of it, of course, is, if we still are in a very tight market, even if demand does not increase, there is still very, very tight supply relative to current demand. So, one of the big question marks at tomorrow's meeting will be the issue of sanctioned oil. And in particular, this kind of double whammy of continued sanctions on Iranian and Venezuelan oil. Last month, the OPEC Secretary General, Mohammed Barkindo, went on record to say, look, quote, we could unlock resources and strengthen capacity right now if oil produced by Iran and Venezuela were allowed to return to the market, end quote. So that's a powerful message that the Secretary General is hinting at, and kind of putting the pressure on this idea of, look, we have the ability to meet the tight demand and supply constraints now. You have to consider two of the biggest, OPEC countries right now are restricted, and so that's another part of the story. Forget about increased investment for future exploration in the reserve. That is certainly going to be top of mind.
Indeed. Well, we're just about to go into a break, Paasha, so we're going to ask you to stand by patiently with us. And viewers, of course, we ask you to stay with us as well. We're going to continue this discussion. And as Paasha there mentioned, we're going to try to discuss gas, and more specifically, possibly Russian gas, as well as Qatari and even Iranian gas, possibly also, as well as the Iran factor overall, because the JCPOA is a huge factor here right now, isn't it? And whether or not the JCPOA is fully revived, what does that then mean for supplies in the market, both of gas as well as of oil, as would it be concerned to the US as well as the Europeans? I'll be back right after this break with Paasha Mahdavi, continuing discussion. Stay with us for that, please. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in The Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi, and we're continuing to discuss OPEC as well as energy geopolitics with Paasha Mahdavi, our esteemed panelist who is joining us live today. Paasha, right before the break, we began just implicitly discussing gas supplies as well around the world. And obviously, the huge factor regarding that right now is Russian gas, right? And Russian supplies, especially to Europe, as well as what many would argue is Russia's use of energy supplies almost as a weapon of sorts, as a weapon of pressure as well, to try to get its way from the Europeans as well as others around the world. What are your thoughts about that, and whether or not Europe can really peel itself completely away from the Russians? I would think that is quite unreasonable to expect, at least this winter.
Well, first, make no mistake, this is, as Vicky Bailey recently put it, this is a humanitarian crisis. This will put millions of people's lives at risk without access to heat and energy in the winter. For example, the French just announced today the possibility of prolonged power shortages in the winter, right? So this is really a very, very a tragic humanitarian issue when it comes to the gas that many Europeans need and beyond for heating in the wintertime. But, with that in mind, and there's been so much pressure, of course, to try to affect Russia's decision-making when it comes to the invasion of Ukraine, trying to put as many sticks on the table, as it were, rather than carrots, to try to change their behavior. But right now, the cracks in the world's response are showing. For example, last week, Gazprom, Russia's national gas company, announced further cuts to exports of gas to Germany via their Nord Stream pipeline. Now it's going to only be delivering gas at 20% its capacity. LNG, liquefied natural gas, this idea of trading gas from farther away as opposed to a pipeline. LNG markets are not ramping up fast enough to displace the Russian gas that's needed for the winter. The Biden promise to ship LNG to Europe, for example, even if it succeeds, it's only going to make up for roughly 10% of what Russia typically exports to Europe. So, on top of that, you have a lot of the conversations around sanctions that are also showing cracks. Sanctions on maritime insurance, which might seem like a bit of a complex and kind of arcane issue, but this is in fact one of the strongest tools other countries have in limiting the ability of Russia to ship oil and gas around the world. These sanctions on maritime insurance that effectively prohibit trade are still on hold 2 months after they were introduced by the EU, because there's pressure by the UK, there's pressure by the US as well, to keep these markets open. So there are a lot of things that need to be tied up before the winter time. And at this moment, it's not looking as though many of these goals are currently attainable.
So, are we saying in a sense, Pasha, that the Europeans will have to make nice at some level with the Russians? The Russians, for example, demanded that everyone buy for energy from them in rubles. Now, that hasn't happened, obviously, across the board. There's been many naysayers saying, no, we're not going to do that. But then it's cut off supplies, as you mentioned, and or reduced supplies to certain. So it's cut off supplies completely to Latvia, for example, because Latvia refused to pay in rubles. Do you think that these countries will have to play ball with the Russians?
It's very hard to know. One of the other indicators that we're seeing now, for example, is this ban on diesel importing from Russia, which, that ban is there in place. It needs to be hit by the end of the year, really January. At the moment, diesel imports from Russia increased this past month, according to the Financial Times. So that's basically what's going on. Prices, for gas on the natural gas side, prices are extremely high. They're 5 times what they used to be a year ago. Future prices see that a high level existing for at least the next 16 months. So there are a lot of options. I don't necessarily think playing ball is one of the ones that many are willing to a pill they're willing to swallow. People have talked a lot about energy efficiency and kind of reduction on the demand side. That is a very hard thing to sell to people, right? We've seen that as having great political backlash in the past. So people being asked to, for example, keep their thermostats lower in the winter time. There are, of course, kind of the rapid attempt to displace gas. And that is certainly a great long-term conversation. We're talking about things like renewables. But it, again, is a real long-term conversation. It takes many years to put many of those online. So ramping up new solar and wind, in particular transmission connections for the existing solar and wind that exist, heat pumps, and the like. One other piece, though, that I find interesting in this conversation of demand side reduction. And by that, I mean, again, just trying to reduce the need for fossil fuels in general, is this issue of transit. And that's one thing that's come up in policy conversations to try to reduce transportation in the coming winter.
Let's then talk as well about the elephant in the room when it comes to energy and even sanctions, as you mentioned, right? And that's the Iran nuclear deal, and just the Iranians, as well as their vast reserves of both gas as well as oil, right? Arguably, the Iranians have not even properly developed their portion of the gas fields which they share with the Qataris, for example, right? As well as, of course, we know the oil supplies. What are your thoughts regarding that and the politics around that? Because there's more talk now on the part of the Americans. Again, putting the onus back on the Iranians, but they are talking more about the JCPOA revival of recent.
That's right. That's been a conversation point since the war started, the invasion of Ukraine, is this, ramping up again, these conversations surrounding the JCPOA, right? The deal that was reached during the tail end of the Obama administration between Iran and effectively the West. So, It has still been a very slow process. There are, a lot of instances of one step forward, two steps back in these conversations. There has not been a lot of evidence that we're close to reachieving that deal or many of the elements of that deal. Things might change, but at the moment, one of the things that is holding back a lot of policymakers in Europe and the United States is these closer ties between Russia and Iran. You mentioned the gas fields that are shared with Qatar. Those fields have been, long waiting for development, and particularly LNG exports. And one of the current partnership conversations between the National Iranian Oil Company and the National Iranian Gas Company are with the Russians and with the Russian state-owned enterprises. And so there is a path forward for a strong partnership that in many ways had been earmarked in the past for Western oil companies and gas companies that had to leave, whether it was sanctions or their own pressure from their own governments. So that rise of those kinds of partnerships makes a lot of Western policymakers a bit uneasy about restoring these kinds of agreements, given that you're starting to see stronger and stronger alliances between the Russian and Iranian governments when it comes to oil and gas production.
I wonder, this is just a hypothetical question, but I wonder if all the stars were to align and the Iranians were to get everything they want once again within the deal, and the deal were to be revived even from the American side, do you see a possibility of that alliance you've just spoken about between the Russians and the Iranians in some ways weakening? Because obviously that would have had to happen for them, the Iranians, to then, willingly go into this deal and then begin supplies in the way that the Americans would want them to, right? I mean, that's quite a break. I mean, is that, do you think, impractical, or do you think the Iranians would put their national interests first beyond any alliance?
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, this is in many ways not the first best option in terms of kind of partnering with, outside oil companies. There are many other technical challenges and geological issues which would suggest other partners rather than Russian oil companies when it comes to extracting gas from the South Pars field. And so that, restarting conversations, for example, with Equinor, Norway's national oil company, Total, France's privately owned oil company, that's probably of greater appeal to many in the Iranian petroleum industry. They see that as probably a better option to getting that gas to market. But those conversations come with a lot of political strings, and many see kind of these Russian partnerships possibly containing fewer strings, whether that's correct or not. So I think if indeed the stars did align, I think there is room for kind of renewed partnerships that had existed, about 15 years ago, to get that gas to market.
And what would that mean? I mean, if the Iranians were to be fully back into then the oil, and even if they were to then finally start working on that portion of the gas field, what would that mean for supplies and for OPEC, right? Because for so many years, the Iranians have been under sanctions of one sort or another. So they have never really been at full capacity supplies, right? So what does this mean then?
That's right. I mean, it goes back to what I was mentioning before about so many of the OPEC countries not being able to hit their assigned OPEC quota, right? So there's already, in many ways, there's no need to adjust the quota and get into those political conversations of who has what market share. There's still this massive hole that exists and has existed for a long time in terms of what many have expected the Iranian petroleum industry to be able to produce and what it's been producing, largely as a result of sanctions, right? And so, I don't see it as being as politically fraught a conversation within the OPEC circle, but there are several other political issues when it comes to allowing Iranian oil back into the market when it comes to kind of long-standing disputes that exist between Iran and many of the OPEC countries. But from a technical standpoint, thinking about the decisions that are made in terms of being able to hit targets and the targets that are set, again, as you mentioned, there's still that big gap, and so filling that gap is of great need for many. And instead of trying to find alternative solutions, and especially losing that share to non-OPEC countries, that's of course one of the biggest fears.
Just under 30 seconds if you can, Pasha. The geopolitical situation, even when it comes to East Asia, right? And I know Pelosi is right now in Taiwan, all those sorts of tensions, How much does that affect oil markets and the nervousness of investors in that regard?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it definitely does. And it's a stark reminder, if we think about this from kind of the 30,000-foot view, a stark reminder of the volatility of the oil and gas market, the political volatility, the geopolitical volatility, and a reminder to many of kind of the viable option of renewables as opposed to fossil fuels going forward. And this is kind of the great irony of this moment right now, is that all of these crises might be looked back upon as kind of the moment when the world fully embraces the clean energy transition. It's exactly what we saw, back in the 70s. As many have noted, Michael Ross, for example, in Foreign Affairs, wrote about the 73 oil embargo as giving this head start in the struggle to avoid
Paasha,
the
I
threat
do
of climate
sincerely
change.
apologize for cutting you off. I'm going to have to leave it there, but we really, really appreciate you taking our time out to speak to us today. That was Paasha Mahdavi speaking to us. He is an associate professor at University of California, Santa Barbara. Viewers, thank you for joining us as well and partaking in this discussion with us. We will, of course, be back next week with another hot topic of the week of international affairs. Thank you very much for watching.